Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you, I give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? You can see straight through my life.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Time to get into another chapter of the Time Travel Handbook. All right, and we're starting right off the bat with a picture. It says an illustration of the Clipper of the Clouds from the 1886 Jules Verne book Robert le Conquérant. I don't know what that means. But I didn't know Jules Verne stuff was in French. Just looks like French to me. Anyway, whatever. There we go. So it's a skyship of some kind. See if I can get closer into the ship itself. All right. Chapter 3, Time Bandits from the 1800s. And like the other chapters, it starts off with two short quotes. The miracle is not to fly in the air or to walk on the water, but to walk on the earth, Chinese proverb. And then the other one is, man is not nearly himself when he achieves the seriousness of a child at play. Heraclitus, Greek philosopher, 500 BC. Time travel as a modern product, especially if allowed to the consumer, would probably soon come under some form of abuse. Time bandits traveling back into time for personal profit would eventually necessitate the need of some sort of time police. This subject has been explored in various movies, including the George Harrison film Time Bandits and the Jean-Claude Van Damme film Time Cop. Many films and television series have featured time travel as their basic plots, including The Time Tunnel, 1968, Sliders, 1986, the British Doctor Who series, the Back to the Future films, and many other productions. Indeed, the theme of time travel is definitely popular with Hollywood. Some may say that it all started with George Powell's film version of the H.G. Wells 1895 novel The Time Machine. In 1960, MGM Films starred Rod Taylor and featured the 1960, starred Rod Taylor and featured a wonderfully Victorian gadget that eventually took the hero to AD 802,701. Others theorize that the invention of the time machine, at least for consumer purposes, in 2112 AD really sparked the whole time travel craze. What? Others theorize that the invention of the time machine in 2112 AD really sparked the whole time travel craze, with a certain altering of history as a result, including the retroactive writing of books and the making of movies and television shows. How boring the future would have been without all the time travelers. They decided that a certain acceleration of history and invention was necessary. Where have all the time travelers gone? Skeptics of the time travel phenomena point out that if time travel were a reality, we would hear much more about time travelers on talk shows and such. Arthur C. Clarke wrote in 1985, quote, "The most convincing argument against time travel is the remarkable scarcity of time travelers. However unpleasant our age may appear to the future, surely one would expect scholars and students to visit us, if such a thing were possible at all. Though they might try to disguise themselves, accidents would be bound to happen, just as they would if we went back to Imperial Rome with cameras and tape recorders concealed under our nylon togas. Time traveling could never be kept secret for very long." End quote. Physicist Paul Nahin, in his scholarly work Time Machines, published by the American Institute of Physics, quotes from physicist McDevitt, quote, "If time travel, could be done, someone would eventually learn how. If that happens, history would be littered with tourists. They'd be everywhere. They'd be on the Santa Maria. They'd be at Appomattox with Polaroids. They'd be waiting outside the tomb, for God's sake, on Easter morning." End quote. Nahin, Clarke, and McDevitt and others want to know, where are all the time travelers? Says Nahin, quote, "From the moment after the first time machine is constructed through the rest of civilization, there would be numerous historians, to say nothing of weekend sightseekers, who would want to visit every important historical event in recorded history. They might each come from a different future, but all would arrive at destinations crowded with temporal colleagues, crowds for which there is no historical evidence." End quote. Nahin quotes another physicist named Fulmer, who commented, quote, "Actually, I know of only one argument against the possibility of time travel that seems to carry any weight at all. This is the fact that it does not appear ever to have happened. That is, it might be argued that there will be no time trips from 1985 to 1975, since we were here in 1975 and saw no time travelers. But this argument is far from conclusive." End quote. Indeed, just because we haven't seen a time traveler on The Tonight Show as a guest doesn't mean that they are not among us right now. It would be dangerous to travel to any ancient periods and any historical events that one might want to visit, such as battles, assassinations, and such. Would be especially hazardous. Nonetheless, time travelers may have risked death, and in parentheses, quote, sorry, but your son died in an accident 2,000 years ago while time traveling, end quote, end parentheses, or close parentheses. And historical reports do show a high incidence of quote-unquote unusual people and quote-unquote odd incidents that might be best explained in terms of time travel. Volumes of books could be filled with incidents from history that may have something to do with time travel. I will mention but a few here. Nearly all of the quote-unquote ancient astronaut evidence that can be found in the hundreds of books on the subject can be alternatively explained in the time travel hypothesis, and have been. British writer Robin Collins covered the ground in his Ancient Astronauts, A Time Reversal in 1976 at the height of the quote, gods from outer space, end quote, craze of the early 70s, which is like Eric von Daniken and all of them. There are various odd accounts of visitations from very human-looking, quote-unquote, angels who warn people, such as Lot, to leave Sodom and Gomorrah before a sudden cataclysm. Knowledge of future events is evidence of a kind for time travel. Similarly, many historical events often have some element of premonition and warning accompanying them. The participants cannot help but complete their parts in the script, but many observers know what is going to happen. Quote, we warned you, end quote, is a commonly heard phrase. Time travelers must use it a lot. There are certain historical personages, the famous Count de Saint-Germain, for example, who seem to have been time-traveling geniuses who came and went as they chose. In some cases, perhaps they even faked their deaths at the appropriate time, much like the hero of the Highlander television series, or sometimes just faded away into the foggy mists of history. Some characters, such as Enoch or Saint-Germain, were never known to have actually died. Neither was the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, probably ancient China's most famous book. Readers of Charles Fort's books or the British publication Fortean Times will already be familiar with reports of strange dimension blurring occurrences from mysterious visitors who seemingly know everything, including the future, to falls of various fishes or frogs from the clear blue sky. As the media becomes faster and more omnipresent, stories of time travelers may begin to appear and may be quickly discounted, but at least they would be reported. As to ancient history, very little description has really come down to us. Starting in the early 1800s, countries with advanced newspaper industries, such as England, Germany, France, and America, started seeing reports of high-tech aerial machines and mysterious men with strange devices, including flying machines akin to UFOs, that interacted briefly with the locals and then disappeared. Unlike similar events in the past, these unusual events actually made it to newspapers and were archived for research in the future. The mysterious airships of the late 1800s. Time travelers? Mysterious airships were apparently crossing the Atlantic Ocean over 100 years ago. William Corliss of the Sourcebook Project mentions in his Unexplained Phenomena calendar for 1999 that the captain and crew of the Lady of the Lake, a British steamer in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of West Africa, south of Cape Verde, observed a strange sight on March 22, 1870. It was a gray object divided into 4 connected sections. Behind it trailed a long hook connected to the center of the UFO. Positioned below the clouds, it flew against the wind and was visible for half an hour. In 1873, at Bonham, Texas, workers in a cotton field suddenly saw a shiny silver object in the sky that came streaking down at them. Terrified, they ran away while the quote-unquote great silvery serpent, as some people described it, swung around and dived at them again. A team of horses ran away and the driver was thrown beneath the wheels of the wagon and killed. A few hours later, that same day in Fort Riley, Kansas, a similar airship swooped down out of the skies at a cavalry parade and terrorized the horses to such an extent that the cavalry drill ended in a tumult. Airships, often with powerful searchlights at their front, plied the skies of North America and other continents during the 1880s and 1890s, and finally culminated in a huge wave of sightings in 1897. These sightings and contacts started in November 1896 in San Francisco, California, when hundreds of residents saw a large, elongated, dark object that used brilliant searchlights and moved against the wind, traveling northwest across Oakland. A few hours later, reports came from other Northern California cities such as Santa Rosa, Chico, Sacramento, and Red Bluff, all describing what appears to be the same airship, a cigar-shaped craft. It is quite possible that this craft was headed for Mount Shasta in Northern California. The airship moved very slowly and majestically, flying low at times, and at night shining its powerful searchlight on the ground. It is worth noting here, as Jacques Vallée did in his book Dimensions, that the airship could do exactly as it cared to, because unlike today, it ran no risk of being pursued. There were no jet squadrons to be scrambled after the aerial intruder, nor anti-aircraft guns or surface-to-air missiles to shoot down this trespassing craft in the sky. However, the airship, clearly not a typical balloon or gas-filled airship of the time, did at times move erratically. Sometimes it would depart, quote, as a shot out of a gun, end quote, change course abruptly, change altitude at great speed, circle and land, and, as previously mentioned, use powerful searchlights to sweep the countryside. These mysterious airships were seen across the United States, from California to Nebraska, Texas, Colorado, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, including many heavily populated urban areas such as Omaha and Milwaukee. On April 10, 1897, thousands of people in Chicago reported seeing a cigar-shaped airship. Jerome Clark reports in the UFO Encyclopedia that on February 1, 1897, the Omaha Daily Beef ran a story of a quote-unquote large glaring light, which hovered, ascended, descended, and moved at a quote-unquote most remarkable speed over Hastings, Nebraska. He also states that the St. Louis Dispatch reported on April 16, 1897, that a St. Louis man claimed to encounter an airship and quote-unquote Martian couple in the hills outside of Springfield, Missouri. He said that they did not speak to him, and that they were handsome, long-haired, and friendly, and they did not wear clothes. Says Clark, quote, apparently they did not understand the concept of time because they were puzzled by his watch, end quote. It is generally agreed that the many accounts of these airships could not be attributed to known airships or technology of the time. The first powered flight was Gifford's steam airship, built in 1852, while the Tissandier brothers built the first electric airship in 1883. Renard and Krebs' electric airship, the La France, was first flown at Chalet-Meudon in 1884. The Schwartz aluminum rigid airship was first flown at Tempelhofer Field, Germany in 1897, and the first successful airship, the Labadie, was test flown in Paris in 1903. A great deal has been made of the airship flap of 1897 in UFO circles, typically seeking to prove that the airships were extraterrestrial vehicles. Yet, as Jacques Vallée points out in Dimensions, the evidence does not point toward extraterrestrial occupants, because those airship operators who engaged in conversation with witness, quote, were indistinguishable from the average American population of the time, end quote. Many occupants did indeed converse with locals and occasionally offered them rides, though few seem to have ever taken up the offers. In a curious incident at Hot Springs, Arkansas, a site of natural crystals, on the night of May 6, 1897, Constable Sumter and Deputy Sheriff McLemore witnessed an airship land on a rainy night. Drawing their Winchesters, they demanded an occupant to identify himself and the airship. A man with a long, dark beard came forth with a lantern in his hand, possibly electric, and, quote, on being informed who we were, proceeded to tell us that he and the others, a young man and a woman, were traveling through the country in an airship. We could plainly distinguish the outlines of the vessel, which was cigar-shaped and about 60 feet long, and looking just like the cuts that have appeared in the papers recently. It was dark and raining, and the young man was filling a big sack with water about 30 yards away, and the woman was particular to keep back in the dark. She was holding an umbrella over her head. The man with the whiskers invited us to take a ride, saying that he could take us where it was not raining. We told him we believed we preferred to get wet. I guess that's... okay. Asking the man why the brilliant light was turned on and off so much, he replied that the light was so powerful that it consumed a great deal of his motive power. Being in a hurry, we left, and upon our return, about 40 minutes later, nothing was to be seen. We did not hear or see the airship when it departed. End quote. And that finally ends the quote. In another fascinating and revealing report, this one from the Houston Post of April 22, 1897, a Mr. John M. Barclay, living near Houston, witnessed an airship on the ground on the night of April 21st at about 11 p.m. Quote, it was a peculiar shaped body with an oblong shape, with wings and side attachments of various sizes and shapes. There were bright lights which appeared much brighter than electric lights. End quote. When he first saw it, it seemed perfectly stationary about 5 yards from the ground. It circled a few times and gradually descended to the ground in a pasture adjacent to his house. He took his Winchester and went down to investigate. As soon as the ship, or whatever it might be, alighted, the lights went out. The night was bright enough for a man to be distinguished several yards away, and when within about 30 yards of the ship he was met by an ordinary mortal who requested him to lay his gun aside as no harm was intended, whereupon the following conversation ensued. Mr. Barclay inquired, "Who are you and what do you want?" The reply by this strange individual was, "Never mind about my name, call it Smith. I want some lubricating oil and a couple of cold chisels, if you can get them, and some bluestone. I suppose the sawmill hard by has the two former articles, and the telegraph operator has the bluestone. Here is a $10 bill. Take it and get us these articles and keep the change for your trouble." Mr. Barclay said, "What have you got down there? Let me go and see it." He who wanted to be called Smith said, "No, we cannot permit you to approach any nearer, but do as we request you, and your kindness will be appreciated, and we will call you some future day and reciprocate your kindness by taking you on a trip." End quote. Said the newspaper reporters, quote, Mr. Barclay went and procured the oil and cold chisels, but could not get the bluestone. They had no change, and Mr. Barclay tendered him with the $10 bill, but same was refused. The man shook hands with him and thanked him cordially and asked that he not follow him to the vessel. As he left, Mr. Barclay called him and asked him where he was from and where he was going. He replied, "From anywhere, but we will be in Greece day after tomorrow." End quote. He got on board when there was again the whirling noise, and the thing was gone. As Mr. Barclay expresses it, like a shot out of a gun. Mr. Barkley is perfectly reliable." End quote. Oh, that was a big long quote with quotes within quotes. While some incidents are baffling to most people, in the context of time travelers, they do not seem so extraordinary. Jacques Vallée thinks the statement from the stranger that he is, quote, "from anywhere but we will be in Greece day after tomorrow," end quote, is absurd. Yet, what is absurd about a vague answer as to one's origins and that he plans to be in Greece in 2 days? In 1897, by the airship technology of the time, this was impossible, and what extraterrestrial, asks Vallée, would state that they would be in France in 2 days. For a human time traveler on his way to Greece, however, the answer seems quite sensible. The airship wave of 1896 and 1897 will never be fully solved. Does it involve time travelers? Records from the future tend to confirm this thesis. Of the 100 or so reported sightings across the country, some were obvious hoaxes and fabrications based on the many newspaper articles appearing at the time. Yet with some genuine sightings, considerable doubt remains as to the nature of these craft. Says Wallace Cheriton at the end of his book, The Great Texas Airship Mystery, quote, "Many 1897 witnesses said they heard a peculiar whirring or whizzing sound that could not be identified. There were several reports that the flying machine hovered in one spot for some time, then quickly disappeared, traveling at a high rate of speed. There was always at least one light that was frequently described as being the brightest light that witnesses had ever seen, and was often said to be considerably more powerful than any incandescent light, which was the only kind they had in 1897. Some witnesses said they saw a bright fluorescent glow about the ship, and many others claimed there were multicolored lights along the sides. If you do any research into reported modern UFO sightings, you will find that similar statements occur frequently." End quote. Sip. In 1890, the 1895 time machine. First, just prior to the airship flap of 1897, a remarkable novel was published, The Time Machine. This 1895 book by H.G. Wells was the first of the inventive scientific fantasies on which he built his early reputation. In the story, a wealthy inventor invents a time machine and travels into the future, stepping out of his machine into what is left of his London basement laboratory. Like Wells' later socio-philosophical works, The Time Machine is a serious story with a political message concerning future relations between the ruling and working classes in industrial society. The time traveler of his story travels by machine to an era in which the world is inhabited by two races, the pleasure-loving Eloi and the ape-like Morlocks, who live underground and feed on the Eloi. As Wells' iconic comment on the outcome of 19th century progress, The Time Machine is a gloomy and pessimistic parable of the future of humankind. Was H.G. Wells somehow introduced to the concept of a time machine by time travelers themselves? This was also around the time of the Wilson brothers of EMI/Thorne and their alleged connection with the Philadelphia experiment. EMI Thorne is British media group based in London that goes back to the late 1800s. Though it is not as powerful a media group as it once was, EMI Thorne is one of the oldest continuing entertainment companies with links back to the early days of Tesla, Westinghouse, Edison, and General Electric, and Marconi's electronic company today known as Marconi Systems, located in the Greater London area, similar to EMI Thorne. Back in 1898, strange things were happening. Nikola Tesla was inventing alternating current and lighting New York City with his amazing new power source. The world would be forever changed, and a vast industry of electrical devices was created overnight. Tesla predicted death rays, anti-gravity, thought machines, and other futuristic devices. The modern era of technology was dawning. Without Tesla's alternating current and pulsed field technology, many important inventions, such as time travel devices, would never have been invented. Okay. Strange objects were still seen in the sky, objects seemingly from the future. Jerome Clark mentions that on March 15, 1901, a Silver City, New Mexico newspaper, the Enterprise, reported that 8 days earlier a local man, Dr. S. H. Millikan, had taken a photograph of a peculiar flying object. The Enterprise stated, quote, "The machine as seen in the picture has the appearance of 3 cigar-shaped objects which seem to be lashed together, the one hanging below the other 2." End quote. Unfortunately, the paper did not reproduce this potentially historic photograph, which has now been lost, Clark says. We could then determine if we were looking at a craft from the future or the past. Clark mentions another curious incident that took place over Indiana on March 17, 1903. Excuse me. There we go. 1903. On that day, a, quote, huge object like a gigantic ripe cucumber with slightly tapered end, end quote, and with 2 rows of windows along the side, hovered over a farm in Helmer, Indiana. The witnesses were the Brosius family, who estimated the cigar-shaped object to be 100 feet long. The Brosius family said that the object zigzagged across the sky at great speed and disappeared. As Clark says, this incident occurred more than 40 years before the era of quote-unquote flying saucers and before UFOs became a household word. Were these time travelers from the future on a package tour of 1903 America? Only the next year, Navy personnel on the USS Supply, a U.S. ship off the coast of Korea, sighted 3 red egg-shaped objects, quote, beneath the clouds. Lieutenant Frank Schofield reported on February 28, 1904, that as the objects were approaching the ship, quote, they passed above the broken clouds. The largest had the apparent area of about 6 suns, the second the size of 2 suns, and the third about the size of the sun. End quote. He further commented that the objects were most remarkable. Schofield became Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in the 1930s and can be considered a reliable witness. The London Daily Mail ran a story on May 20th, 1909, reporting that 2 nights earlier, while walking along a mountain path, a Cardiff, Wales man named C. Lethbridge saw a quote-unquote large tube-shaped construction. Inside it were, quote, 2 men in heavy fur coats. When they saw Mr. Lethbridge, they spoke excitedly to each other in a foreign language and sailed away, end quote. Many modern UFO researchers consider this case a probable hoax, largely because the technology involved seemed impossible for the time period. These may have been time travelers, and the quote-unquote large tube-shaped construction may have been their spacecraft time travel device. William Corliss reports that on February 9, 1913, residents near Esterhazy, Saskatchewan, reported a strange formation of lights in the heavens that resembled an quote-unquote express train in the sky. The procession of bright, fiery lights moving majestically emerged from the northwest and continued across the sky in several successions for more than 3 minutes. The lights were accompanied by rumbling like distant thunder. Corliss says that they were also seen by professional astronomers, but their explanation of the lights being meteors leaves some doubt due to their motion and appearance, moving across the sky instead of straight down to an impact, for instance. Excuse me, can you tell me what time it is? Closer to our own time period are other disturbingly familiar encounters with ordinary humans in unusual craft. These humans may well have been time travelers. After the first reports of flying saucers of the late 1940s, several years after the so-called Philadelphia experiment, the year 1950 saw such books as Behind the Flying Saucers by Frank Scully and Flying Saucers over Los Angeles by Dwayne Johnson. Frank Scully in Behind the Flying Saucers mentions the crash of a UFO near Aztec, New Mexico on March 25, 1948. Scully claims that the craft crashing on the Rocky Plateau in northern New Mexico near Farmington might have been Venusian. More curiously, it was claimed that the investigators recovered the bodies of 16 beings, apparently humans, who were clad in the style of 1890. Scully also speculated that the craft, quote, probably flew on magnetic lines of force, end quote. He did not speculate on whether these were time travelers making a disastrous side trip from 1890. The crash at Aztec remains a highly disputed event, but the Farmington area of New Mexico was a hotbed of UFO activity in the late 40s and early 50s, as recorded by Johnson and Thomas in their book Flying Saucers over Los Angeles. For instance, on August 20th, 1949, the famous astronomy professor Clyde Tombaugh witnessed a large cigar-shaped craft with a row of lit windows along the side from a home just outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico. Professor Tombaugh is the credited discoverer of the planet Pluto in 1930. Similarly, at 8:30 in the evening on January 20th, 1951, personnel at the Sioux City, Iowa control tower warned a Mid-Continent Airlines DC-3 about to take off to watch out for an approaching unidentified aircraft. Once in the air, the DC-3 crew and passengers saw a light closing in on the airline at great speed. As the light got closer, the crew could see that the craft was a well-lit, cigar-shaped structure. Rows of windows were reported along the sides. The object paced the DC-3 for a short time and then shot off out of sight at great speed. A few years later, on April 7, 1956, South African contactee Elizabeth Clarer met the love of her life, a handsome man named Akon. Akon was a gorgeous human hunk who was from the planet Meton. Elizabeth claimed in her book, Beyond the Light Barrier, that when she became pregnant, she went with Akon to the planet Meton for 4 months. Meton was a lot like Earth, only in a different time, presumably the future. Elizabeth maintained until her death in 1994 that Akon was her only love and that he and her son would visit her periodically. Hey man, which way to the 60s? For fun-loving time travelers, the 1960s and 70s would be popular destinations. Hallucinogenic drugs were still legal, the sexual revolution was getting started, and people were beginning to wear funny clothes and look different. This would help odd-looking time travelers blend in. Being hip isn't always easy for time travelers. Strange visitations of men in black and flying saucer sightings became more and more common. At approximately 11 a.m. on April 18, 1961, 60-year-old chicken farmer Joe Simonton of Eagle River, Wisconsin, had a highly unusual encounter. He was attracted outside by a peculiar noise similar to, quote, knobby tires on a wet pavement, end quote. Stepping into his yard, he faced a silvery, saucer-shaped object, quote-unquote brighter than chrome, which appeared to be hovering close to the ground without actually touching it. The object was about 12 feet high and 30 feet in diameter. A hatch opened about 5 feet from the ground, and Simonton saw 3 men inside the machine. One was dressed in a black two-piece suit. The occupants were about 5 feet tall. Smooth-shaven, they appeared to resemble Italians, quote unquote. They had dark hair and skin and wore outfits with turtleneck tops and knit helmets. From the description, they may have been wearing overalls and been Rastafarians, since Rastafarians often wear such knit helmets, as in the film Banzai Buckaroo and the Eighth Dimension. Such knit helmets may hide hair, ears, headphones, or other things. One of the men held up a jug apparently made of the same material as the saucer. His motioning to Joe Simonton seemed to indicate that he needed water. Simonton took the jug, went inside the house, and filled it. As he returned, he saw that one of the men inside the saucer was, quote, frying food on a flameless grill of some sort, end quote. The interior of the ship was black, quote, the color of wrought iron, end quote. Simonton saw several instrument panels and heard a slow humming sound similar to the hum of a generator. When he made a motion indicating he was interested in the food, one of the men, who was also dressed in black but with a narrow red trim along the trousers, handed him 3 cookies, about 3 inches in diameter, and perforated with small holes. The whole affair lasted about 5 minutes. Finally, the man closest to the witness attached a kind of belt to a hook in his clothing and closed the hatch in such a way that Simonton could scarcely detect its outline. Then the object rose about 20 feet from the ground before taking off straight south, causing a blast of air that bent some nearby pine trees. Along the edge of the saucer, the witness recalls, were exhaust pipes 6 or 7 inches in diameter. The hatch was about 6 feet high and 30 inches wide, and although the object has always been described as a saucer, its actual shape was that of 2 inverted bowls. Simonton later reported to 2 sheriff's deputies that he ate one of the cakes and thought it, quote, tasted like cardboard, end quote. The United States Air Force, which examined the remaining 2 cakes, put it more scientifically. Quote, the cake was composed of hydrogenated fat, starch, buckwheat hulls, soya bean hulls, wheat bran. Bacteria and radiation reading were normal for this material. Chemical, infrared, and other destructive type tests were run on this material. The Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare concluded that the material was an ordinary pancake of terrestrial origin, end quote. To well-known UFO investigator Jacques Vallée, this case is credible, yet absurd. What sort of extraterrestrials look like ordinary humans wearing overalls, oshkosh by gosh, and hand out perfectly ordinary buckwheat pancakes to chicken farmers in Wisconsin? Interdimensional ones, he concludes. Time-traveling ones, I conclude. It is well known that time-space distortion and strange electromagnetic effects occur around many UFO encounters. On April 4, 1966, Ronald Sullivan was driving east of Bealiba, Victoria, Australia, when he was astonished to see his headlight beams bend as if they were pieces of pipe, an effect that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Sullivan stopped immediately, got out, and saw a brilliant light flashing in a field like a searchlight. He then looked up and saw that the searchlight was attached to a UFO that was just at that moment departing the scene. Later, his car and headlights were in perfect working order. Many persons have reported that their cars have come to a complete halt for no apparent reason when a UFO hovers near to them. Sullivan's bent headlights may have had to do with dimensional distortion from a time machine suddenly entering the vicinity, distorting all fields around it. Reports of craft with powerful searchlights on them go back to the 1880s. Another curious incident occurred on December 3rd, 1967, when a patrolman named Herb Shermer of Ashland, Nebraska, had an unusual experience that changed his life forever. After writing in his logbook that night that he, quote, saw a flying saucer at the junction of highways 6 and 63, believe it or not, end quote, Shermer reported he had seen an object with a row of flickering lights take off from the highway. The patrolman decided to follow it and drove up a dirt road toward the intense light. He tried to call the police in Wahoo, Nebraska, but his radio would not work. His car died, typical of being around a strong electromagnetic field, and he stared at the object, which was metallic and football-shaped and surrounded by a silvery glow. It was making a whooshing sound, and the lights were flickering rapidly. Legs appeared under the craft, and it landed. Shermer wanted to drive home, but he was, quote, prevented by something in his mind, end quote. The occupants of the craft came toward the car. He was unable to draw his revolver. A greenish gas was shot toward the car, and an occupant pulled a small object from a holster, flashed a bright light at him, and he passed out. When Shermer woke, he realized that 20 minutes were missing in his life. Later, he was put under hypnosis. The next thing Shermer remembered under hypnosis was rolling down the car window and talking to the occupant of the craft, who pressed something against the side of his neck and asked him, quote, "Are you the watchman over this place?" End quote. He then pointed to a power plant that was visible and asked him, quote, "Is this the only source of power you have?" End quote. Shermer was taken aboard the craft. He saw control panels and computer-like machines. The occupants appeared to be normal human beings and were wearing coveralls. Coveralls with an emblem of a winged serpent. They told him their craft operated by reverse electromagnetism, and they drew their power from large water reservoirs. Quote, "To a certain extent they want to puzzle people," end quote. Shermer reported under hypnosis. At one point, one of the men took Shermer to a large window of the ship, pointed to the deserted landscape around them, and said gravely, quote, "Watchman, someday you will see the universe," end quote. In an apparent attempt at disinformation, they told him they were from another galaxy, that he would not remember being inside the ship, and concluded, quote, "You will not speak wisely about this night. We will return to see you 2 more times," end quote. In a similar incident near Temple, Oklahoma, on March 23, 1966, an instructor in aircraft electronics at Shepherd Air Force Base was driving to work at 5 a.m. on Route 65. Approaching the intersection with Highway 70, he suddenly encountered a large fish-shaped object blocking the highway. He pulled over and approached the object, seeing a man run inside the strange craft, which then rose rapidly. In a telephone interview, the instructor told UFO researcher Jacques Vallée, quote, "1 mile before the intersection, I saw a very bright light a mile or so to my right, and I supposed it was a truck having trouble on the highway. I went on to turn west on Highway 70. I went a quarter of a mile or so and changed my mind and thought that it was a house that was being moved down the highway in the early morning hours. It was parked on the highway, and I got within 100 yards of it and stopped, got out of the car, and started trotting toward the object, leaving the car lights on and my engine running. I got about 15 steps or so, and I happened to think I had a Kodak on the front seat, and I would like to get a picture. I hesitated just a second, and while I did, why, this man that was dressed in military fatigues, which I thought was a master sergeant, this insignia was on his right arm, and he had a kind of cap with the bill turned up, weighed approximately 180 pounds and about 5'9". He looked perfectly ordinary, asked Jacques Vallée. Oh yes, he was just a plain old GI mechanic, or a crew chief or whatever. He might happened to be on that crew. He had a flashlight in his hand, and he was almost kneeling on his right knee, with his left hand touching the bottom of the fuselage." End quote. The object looked like an aluminum airliner with no wings or tail, and with no seams along the fuselage. It lifted up vertically for about 50 feet and headed southeast almost straight backward, off by about 10 degrees, at a speed estimated to be about 720 miles per hour, judging by the barns it illuminated along its path across the valley. It was the size of a cargo plane, but had no visible means of propulsion. The witness was grilled by a roomful of officers at the Air Force Base. A truck driver down the road had observed the same object. Concludes Vallée on his sighting, quote, "Whoever he was, the man in the baseball cap was no interplanetary explorer. This is only one of many sightings in which the pilots are described as ordinary humans. Whatever they are, the occupants of such craft are not genuine extraterrestrials." End quote. Similarly, on January 25, 1967, an unnamed Minnesota man was driving his pickup truck at 4:30 a.m. near Winsted, Minnesota, when he suddenly stalled. He got out of the truck to see what had happened when a brilliantly illuminated object became visible approaching him. He dashed back into the vehicle and locked the doors. The UFO landed on the road, and a man dressed in blue coveralls and wearing, quote, "something like a glass fishbowl on his head," end quote, emerged briefly before re-entering the craft and flying away. A glass fishbowl on his head. How are we doing? I think, is that the end of the chapter? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we got like a page and a half and then a few pictures, and then we're done with the chapter. What is fascinating about these and many other encounters is that aside from the fact that each involves a craft of a completely different design from those we are accustomed to seeing in this century, each of these events appears to be a highly mundane encounter with perfectly normal human beings. The occupants appear to be of our own planet and are not threatening and often not even apparently observing the witnesses or wanting contact with them. They are merely going about their own business, whatever that may be, or repairing some malfunction on their craft. Some of these occupants do have more interaction with others, including the inevitable falling in love with someone from another time. In the case of the Ashland, Nebraska sighting, the occupants may have been looking for a source of power or something to refuel their ship. Upon seeing the electrical generating station, they were prompted to ask, perhaps in surprise at its primitiveness, quote, "Is this the only source of power you have?" End quote. Later, when Shermer is informed that one day he will see the stars, this may merely mean that time travel and space travel is within the easy reach of all mankind. The time travel prayer. Imagine there is a bank that credits your account each morning with $86,400. It carries over no balance from day to day. Every evening, it deletes whatever part of the balance you failed to use during the day. What would you do? Draw out every penny, of course. Each of us has such a bank. Its name is time. Every morning it credits you with 86,400 seconds. Every night it writes off as lost whatever of this you failed to invest to good purpose. It carries over no balance. It allows no overdraft. Each day it opens a new account for you. Each night it burns the remains of the day. If you fail to use the day's deposit, the loss is yours. There is no going back. There is no drawing against the tomorrow. You must live in the present on today's deposit. Invest it so as to get from it the utmost in health, happiness, and success. The clock is running. Make the most of the day. And then, I guess this is the prayer. To realize the value of 1 year, ask a student who failed a grade. To realize the value of 1 month, ask a mother who gave birth to a premature baby. To realize the value of 1 week, ask the editor of a weekly newspaper. To realize the value of 1 hour, ask the lovers who are waiting to meet. To realize the value of 1 minute, ask a person who missed the train. And that is the end of the chapter except for the pictures. So, here we go. The first one, 2 illustrations of the airships seen over the skies of America starting in the 1880s. Note the powerful searchlights on both craft. So I'll try to focus on the top one first. There we go. Come on, focus. There we go. And then moving to the second one. Okay. And then the next one is a single picture. Above, on August 20th, 1949, Professor Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer credited with discovering Pluto in 1930, saw this giant cigar-shaped UFO outside the Las Cruces, New Mexico. Las Cruces, New Mexico. It was very similar to the craft described in the late 1800s. There you go. And one more page of pictures, and then that's the end of this chapter, and we'll call it a session. Above was a U.S. Navy battleship sent through time. Oh, these have to do with the Philadelphia experiment, which is the next chapter. But I'll go ahead and read them. That's fine. Was a U.S. Navy battleship sent through time and space as theorized in the book The Philadelphia Experiment. Below, a cover from Fate magazine, the lead story being Al Bielek's account of Project Rainbow. Project Rainbow. I've not heard of that. I'll have to look that up. Hopefully he'll go over it in the book. So that's the one about the Philadelphia experiment and the cover of Fate. The Philadelphia experiment. The day aliens crashed in Brazil. All right, so, yep, Philadelphia experiment, a history is the next chapter. We'll pick it up on Tuesday. And, yeah, I'm going to have to read about see if I'm going to look ahead and see if he talks about the Project Rainbow. Is there an index here? There's not. That's okay. That's fine. I'll just do a quick search online about it, and hopefully he does talk about it. So that'll be that. 10:30. I think I might game, maybe. I'm really still more inclined to play Mass Effect than I am Force Unleashed. The Force Unleashed is a little bit more of an arcade type game, honestly. It's not as enjoyable as Mass Effect 3, so probably Mass Effect 3. So I'm going to go ahead and end it, and I'll see you in the next session.
Is broken, one is because I have seen apart. I have known about the body. I didn't have anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take if you leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You left me shocked. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? You have no answers. Don't know without you how it lasts.